Kia ora koutou, everybody. It's now 1:30, and so we'll get started as others continue to join us today. Welcome, and thank you for joining this open Zoom today, where we will be discussing the Commission's latest advice on NZ ETS unit limits and price control settings for the 2025 to 2029 period. So today, in the webinar, you're going to hear from our Chief Executive, Joe Hendy, and one of our key climate change commissioners, Catherine Leining, and they'll provide us with a high-level overview of the role of our work will play in helping make the ETS as effective as possible. There will be an opportunity, hopefully around 30 minutes at the end, for you to have your questions answered. When asking a question, can you please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen? We'll try and get as many of those questions answered as we can during the webinar. And for those that we don't get time to, please feel free to email us here at hello@climatecommission.government.nz. And we're also recording this session, and so it will be made available afterwards for any of you who would like to share it, or who may have missed something that we spoke to during the session. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Joe Hendy to open up the conversation. Joe is our Chief Executive here at the Climate Change Commission. Prior to this, she's done an awful lot of other things around, including leading the Secretariat of the Interim Climate Change Committee, which oversaw the committee's inquiry into renewable electricity. She's also formerly been Director of Research and Analysis for the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment. She's led independent environmental investigation issues and spent some time with Motu, and we're now very lucky to have Joe here with us, and she'll take away the first session. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Simon, and kia ora koutou, ko Joe Hendy aho. As Simon said, I'm the Chief Executive of Hei Poarangi, the Climate Change Commission, and I'm here to kick off this webinar with an overview of what we talk about today, why it's important, and give you a high-level understanding of the Commission's role. The government has choices about the tools it uses to take action on climate change, and the ETS is one of those tools, a very important tool. And indeed, a well-functioning NZ ETS is in everyone's interests. The Commission is tasked with looking at how we get to our climate targets, but how we get there is important. And tools like the NZ ETS need to be able to adjust course to respond to the unexpected obstacles that come along the way, so we can stay on track to meet our country's climate goals. We give independent advice every year to help keep the ETS on track. Then it's over to government to decide what to do with that advice. So this year, we have highlighted two particular problems to sort out. The first problem relates to the units in the ETS. Now, one unit in the ETS allows 1 tonne of emissions. For emissions to go down, units need to decline, but the opposite has happened. There are too many units, and this risks allowing too many emissions, and also affecting the stability of the ETS in the long term. These surplus units have come about from particular historical issues. The second problem is about broader issues with the ETS, which risk achieving our longer-term target. These issues are the following. A, the incentives for planting forest, which help us absorb emissions. These incentives are not durable beyond the mid-2030s. And B, incentives to encourage producing those emissions in the first place are not adequate. So sorting out these two issues will help give longer-term stability in the ETS and for investors who need to make long-term decisions. Next, moving on to the next slide, I'm going to give some brief context around our role at the Commission and the advice we've given so far. Now, the Commission gives independent advice on the choices government needs to make to help the country achieve our collective climate goals. And in our advice, we also point out the opportunities and risks that sit alongside those choices. The Commission also independently monitors progress on how the country is tracking and reports that publicly. So far, we've produced a number of pieces of advice. In fact, we're never standing still. We've put out our first set of advice in 2021, where we detailed the ambitious and achievable paths New Zealand can take to meet the country's climate targets. Since then, we've given a number of additional pieces of different aspects of the country's climate transition. Looking ahead to this current piece of advice, it comes out alongside some other related reports. The first one was the report that we gave in December 2023. And this is where the Commission provided advice to the government on the second emissions reduction plan. Now, that's currently sitting with the government, and the government will be developing that plan, and it's due to be finalised by the end of 2024. Looking ahead, in April 2024, the Commission will be going out and consulting on draft advice on some really key pieces of our climate transition. We'll be consulting on what the fourth emissions budget should be. We'll be undertaking our 5-yearly review of the 2050 target in the Climate Change Response Act. And we'll also, alongside this, be looking at what we do about international aviation and shipping emissions. In the middle of this year, the Commission will publish its first annual monitoring report, showing our independent assessment of progress towards meeting emissions budgets and the 2050 target, as well as our assessment of the plans to deliver them. Our advice, of course, sits within the context of intensifying climate change impacts at home and across the world. And as a country, we have started to make progress, and we need to build on this momentum to strengthen and accelerate efforts to meet our country's climate change goals. Many of the actions that will reduce emissions will help us in other ways too. For example, investing in renewable energy will help reduce the inflationary impacts of dependency on oil imports. Investing in low emissions transport, low emissions buildings, public transport, for example, will help reduce cost of living and improve air quality and health. Investing in low emissions agriculture, the bioeconomy, the circular economy will help create new economic opportunities. And investing in native forests as a long-term store of carbon will also help restore our native plants and animals, reduce erosion, and improve water quality. Moving to my final slide before I hand over to Catherine, who's going to cover the details of our advice, I'm going to quickly recap how the New Zealand ETS works at a very high level. So the New Zealand ETS is a market created by the government. It is intended to support the country to meet its climate targets. So these are the emissions budgets, the 2050 target in the Climate Change Response Act, and what we committed to under the Paris Agreement, commonly called the Nationally Determined Contribution, or the NDC. The emissions trading scheme requires certain businesses to hand in units for the year's worth of emissions. This encourages them to change how they do things so they can avoid having to pay extra cost. These units, called NZUs, can be bought from government auctions, created from Forestry, and in some circumstances are available for free as what's called industrial allocation. Under the scheme, all of these are treated as the same currency. For the NZ ETS to work well, the units in the scheme need to decline in line with the declining emissions reductions targets. Like a game of musical chairs, every year the government sets a certain number of units, lowering the number available, reducing how many emissions are allowed across the economy to keep us tracking downward towards our climate targets. By limiting the supply in the market, this puts a price on emissions for those who need the units, which changes the relative prices of different goods and services across the economy. And this influences the behaviour of both producers and consumers by discouraging activities involving higher levels of greenhouse gases and rewarding lower emissions choices. The New Zealand ETS covers every sector in the economy except biological emissions and nitrous oxide from agriculture. Participants in the New Zealand ETS face the costs associated with emissions, but are left with the choice of how best to reduce their own emissions. The scheme has a number of settings that need to be defined. And the Climate Change Commission has been given the specific job of every year recommending what these settings should be. This is the third time the Commission has given this advice. The two sets of settings, the dials of the scheme involved, are as follows. The first set are the unit limits. These include how many units can be auctioned into the scheme and the overall limit. These help implement what's commonly referred to as the cap on emissions permitted from the sectors covered by the scheme. The second set are the price controls that apply at auctions. These are price guardrails that encourage the price of units sold at government auctions from going too high or too low. When reviewing the existing settings, we strike a balance between supporting the stability and the market to understand how the scheme will work into the future, and so that they can be confident in making investments, while also allowing changes to the settings when necessary so that the scheme can do what it needs to do, and that is help reduce emissions to meet our targets. Regular adjustments are needed to maintain the cap of units to keep the scheme functioning as intended. Now I'm going to pass over to Catherine to speak to the details of our advice. Thanks very much. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Jo. Kia ora koutou. Ko Catherine Leining, aho. I'm one of the commissioners at the Climate Commission, and I have a background in emissions trading. I'm going to go over the key judgments, findings, and recommendations in our advice. And before I dive in, I really want to acknowledge the work by the staff of the Climate Change Commission. It's been really extensive to support this advice. So I'll start with the settings for unit supply. For the NZ ETS to work well, the units in the scheme need to decline in line with the declining emissions reduction targets, as Jo has just explained. A large number of units have built up in the scheme over time. While having some stockpiled units helps the market operate well, we have identified a level of surplus that presents a risk of allowing too many emissions. We estimate that this surplus has increased to 68 million units within a range of 51 to 84 million units. Relative to last year's estimate, this represents an increase of about 40% or 19 million units. This change is due to new information since our last advice. First, more forestry units have entered the market. While new to the scheme, much of the stored carbon that generated those units has already been counted toward previous targets to reduce emissions. Second, some of the pre-1990 forestry units freely allocated in the past are more likely to enter the market than we previously thought. And finally, we reduced our estimate of hedging by non-forestry participants. The methodology that we've used for NZ ETS settings is consistent with our previous advice and existing regulations. We set the cap on emissions in the scheme based on emissions budgets as stepping stones to the 2050 target and the domestic contribution to our 2030 NDC. This lines up with sector sub-targets in the government's first emissions reduction plan. So in this slide, the blue bar on the left shows our assessment of the NZ ETS cap over 2024 to 2030. We have factored in the latest historical emissions data. The green bar on the right shows the unit volume that would be available to the market under the status quo settings extended through 2029 and 2030. The planned auction volume is on top, followed by industrial free allocation and the historical surplus. And you can see the margin of supply that falls above the dashed line. To calculate the surplus, we start with the total stockpiled units in the scheme. This is roughly 160 million units. Then we account for the units that may not come to market because they are either held to cover future unit obligations when forests are harvested, or they're held long-term because they were allocated for free in the past in relation to pre-1990 forests, or they're held by emitters to fix their compliance costs, a common practice known as hedging. This leaves a remaining surplus that could come to market and pose a risk to emissions budgets. Now, I want to take just a moment to explain the stockpile impacts of the forestry units that entered the scheme last year. Emissions returns for forests registered in the NZ ETS were due in 2023 for the previous 5-year reporting period, 2018 to 2022. These forests could then be issued units dating back to 2018. This means many forestry units that entered the market in 2023 actually relate to carbon dioxide removals that occurred prior to the beginning of the current emissions reduction targets. That means before 2021 for the 2030 NDC, or before 2022 for the first emissions budget. When they aren't backed by carbon dioxide removals within the relevant accounting period, forestry units contribute to the surplus and could allow emissions beyond the NZ ETS cap in the same way as other historical units. Now, the next slide, please. So this figure lays out our advice for proposed annual auction volumes and the NZ ETS cap over 2025 through 2029. For reference, it shows the regulated values for 2024, as well as an indicative 2030 projection. This year, we judged that this increased surplus estimate meets the bar of allowing changes to all future years of the unit limit settings in regulations. This is because it significantly affects the proper functioning of the NZ ETS and means the current regulations no longer align with emissions reduction targets. So we have advised on changes to the current regulations from 2025 to 2028, as well as the new regulations for 2029. Under our advice, the surplus would be reduced to 0 by 2030. This is consistent with the principle under current regulations. Compared to the unit limits currently in regulations, our updated recommended unit limits would reduce auction volumes by around 20 million units over the 4 years of 2025 to 2028. This change corrects for new oversupply in the market to keep the market more in line with targets. It does not reduce total market supply below what the market would have expected when emissions budgets were set. Other factors have also contributed to smaller changes in the recommended auction volumes. For example, our recommendation reflects a technical adjustment related to liquid fossil fuel emissions, as was in our previous advice, an updated forecast of industrial free allocation, and refinements to more accurately reflect the ETS coverage of synthetic greenhouse gases. We do note that last year's legislative changes to industrial free allocation have not yet been reflected in our settings, but this would have an impact on future supply settings. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a summary comparing the auction volumes in existing regulations and our recommendations in our advice. We consider these changes are needed to support the scheme to function more effectively. Go ahead and next slide, please. So as Joe was explaining, the ETS has 2 kinds of price controls. The cost containment reserve, which allows the government to sell reserve units if the auction price reaches very high levels, and the auction reserve price, which is the price below which the government will not auction units. These help manage the risk of unit prices at auction being out of line with what is needed to reach emissions budgets. In our advice, we concluded the price control settings already in regulations are fit for purpose and can remain as is with minor adjustments for inflation. Note that the 2030 value is indicative. As when we first recommended these settings in 2022, our analysis accounted for uncertainty in considering price discovery in the market, including uncertainty about projected emissions trends in the future. We also considered the potential impacts of emissions prices on households and the economy, inflation, international emissions prices, and other considerations as required in the legislation. Based on that analysis, we think the existing cost containment reserve and auction reserve price triggers give us a sufficiently wide corridor for price discovery in line with emissions budgets. So how will the ETS settings impact on New Zealanders? Well, many households and businesses will be able to take up options that involve lower levels of emissions, such as changing how they travel or move goods or heat buildings. This means that emissions pricing will impact on them less and less over time. The impacts of emissions pricing, however, are not felt evenly across communities. Some households are unable to afford low emissions options, and some simply do not have access to them. This is particularly relevant now, as higher inflation over the past 2 years has caused more people to struggle with the cost of living. Our recent advice on policy options for the government's next emissions reduction plan recommends continued use of targeted support for people less able to cope with the impacts of emissions pricing, rather than delaying climate action. Can I have the next slide, please? As Joe mentioned, there are some ongoing gaps in government policy that will affect the ETS and create uncertainty for market participants. We raise them at a high level in this advice as they undermine the ability of the ETS settings to serve their purpose. We've provided more detail in our December 2023 advice on the government's second emissions reduction plan. One key issue is the government's goals for reducing emissions and using forests to meet its target, and the role of the NZ ETS. In its current form, the ETS allows action on gross emissions to be displaced by carbon storage by forests. As a country, we need both, and will be worse off if one ends up being substituted for the other. Over the long term, meaning from the mid-2030s onwards, the NZ ETS will not provide durable incentives for planting the forests needed to reach net zero by 2050 and sustain it afterward. Note the Commission did not make a recommendation on what particular policy option to pursue, but we did lay out some high-level pros and cons. There's an opportunity for the government to address those issues in the next plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions covering 2026 to 2030. This is due in December 2024. And next slide, please. Another key policy issue is clarifying the plan for the 2030 NDC and the role of the NZ ETS. Under legislation, the Commission must consider how NZ ETS settings accord with both our domestic and international climate targets. In this figure, the orange line shows the trajectory of the country's 2030 NDC, and the blue shaded area shows the gap relative to emissions budgets. The gap can be met through additional domestic effort and/or emissions reductions from overseas, and that raises two key issues for our advice. The first issue is how the NZ ETS potentially could be used alongside complementary policies to lock in further emissions reduction opportunities at home and reduce the need to look overseas. The government has two choices here. First, it could reduce the NZ ETS emissions cap to lock in the reductions from complementary policies and then reduce the need for overseas emissions reductions. This would broadly maintain emissions price expectations relative to when emissions budgets were set. Alternatively, it could leave the NZ ETS emissions cap the same while using complementary policies to redistribute mitigation efforts and costs within the market. If the government wishes to speed up domestic emissions reductions and reduce the need for overseas emissions reductions, it will need to spell out how this will work. In the absence of clear government policy, we have deferred consideration of this issue in our advice. We instead flag this as an urgent issue for the government to address in its second emissions reduction plan. And the second big issue in this space is for how the how the government will source overseas emissions reductions to help bridge the remaining gap for the 2030 NDC. The government could do the purchasing itself and/or devolve the purchasing to ETS participants. The latter was done in the past, but under very different circumstances. Government direction on this issue is important, both for maintaining confidence in the market and for demonstrating progress internationally toward achieving the 2030 NDC. The Commission's future advice on accordance of ETS settings with domestic and international targets will take account of government policy decisions on these issues. And I will now hand back to Joe to talk about what happens next.
Thank you, Catherine. So now it is over to the government to work out what their decision will be. And they have until the 30th of September to set the regulations. The Commission, as I said earlier, provides advice every year on the settings, and our next advice covering the 2026 to 2030 period is due in March 2025. And as Catherine mentioned, alongside this, the government is currently developing its next emissions reduction plan, and that's due at the end of 2024. So that is the opportunity for the government to take a look at the wider issues that we've identified around the ETS and decide what it's going to do around them. Okay, that's it from me. So I'm going to hand over back to Simon.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both, Joe and Catherine. Look, we've got a heck of a lot of questions, which is fantastic. And so what I'm going to do is just whip straight into those. Catherine, we've got a question here from Dan Brunskill. And Dan's asking, have you done any analysis on how your advice might impact revenue earned from the ETS auctions? If not, can you provide a high-level comment on what sort of impact the advice could have on unit prices and revenue? So look, that's a great question. But I guess just for me to add to that, proceeds from the ETS auction depend on both the volume of units sold as well as the price at which they're sold.
That's correct. Thanks so much for the question. Appreciate receiving that. So far, the ETS has generated auction revenue of $3.3 billion New Zealand. And there's always a question every year about how many units will be sold at auction and what the revenues that will be generated from that. As Simon just explained, that's a function of both the price and the supply that go out at auction. It's important to emphasize that the ETS was really developed as a tool for reducing emissions. Its primary purpose is not to generate revenue. It is possible to adjust the settings to increase the revenue, for example, by reducing industrial allocation. And so there are some trade-offs to be managed there. But what we consider is that we aren't actually reducing supply, we're actually correcting for an oversupply in the market and trying to keep supply parameters in line with emissions budgets. So it is really hard to predict exactly what the impact will be on the auction revenues that come out. But it's important also to realize that auction revenue is not the only piece of cost that we need to be keeping an eye on, because whenever the government issues units, it also has to account for a liability in its books. And then we also have to be looking at how much extra it's going to cost to meet our 2030 NDC and future NDCs if we continue to have a surplus in the market. So it's really important to keep a long-term view on what the costs and benefits are of the auction volume in the ETS. And ultimately, we're looking for a system that helps us to meet our emissions targets.
Thank you. Joe, a short but punchy question for you. Why is agriculture still outside the ETS?
When we're talking about agriculture being outside of the ETS, I think that's important to, first of all, understand that it's in relation to biological methane and nitrous oxide, because of course agriculture involves energy as well, and transport, and that is of course covered by the ETS. The government has a different approach to encouraging reducing emissions from agricultural emissions, and so that is something that we are expecting detail about in the second emissions reduction plan when the government produces that.
Thank you. A question here for Catherine, which is, how is it there remain so many surplus credits in a system after a year of failed ETS auctions? I'd heard this would soak up the surplus credits.
That's an excellent question. And I had the same question when we were beginning the development of this advice. When the auctions were declined last year, the market didn't have 14 million units that had been anticipated. The volume of the new forestry that has entered the system is really substantial. And as I was mentioning in my forward comments, that doesn't actually represent removals that count toward our targets within the accounting period. And so that has been a major contribution to the level of supply. And then there were additional considerations that I highlighted, like changes to hedging and changes to our assessment about pre-1990 forestry free allocation entering the market. But the big factor is really the introduction of so much additional forestry into the system with removals that don't necessarily count toward our targets. And just for reference, I believe it took about 10 years for the first 300,000 hectares of forestry to be registered in the ETS, and then 1 year to add 200,000 hectares. So that shows the magnitude of the increase that we're dealing with. Now, there is a lot of uncertainty about exactly when surplus units will come to the market. And so I do want to emphasize there's a wide range there, and we're going to need to keep an eye on forestry behavior, whether people choose to harvest or to convert to permanent forests, and that will affect the flow of surplus units into the market.
Thank you. A question here for either of you, but I might ask Joe to have first go. Toitu is not accepting offsets from the NZ ETS. Are you giving any advice on how to handle this?
Oh, I think I'll hand straight to Catherine on that one because she's
Excellent.
the real expert here.
Thank you,
Thank
Catherine.
you. I think it's really important to make a distinction between the compliance carbon market that's used to meet ETS obligations and then what happens in the voluntary carbon market. So this is for businesses and other entities that want to create their own target and their own offsetting system to achieve it. Toitu is operating in the voluntary carbon market space and is looking at how to advise its clients on the types of mitigation that would count internationally as a voluntary offset. Under the current settings of the emissions trading scheme, forestry NZUs automatically get counted toward New Zealand's targets under the Paris Agreement, and that double counting issue can be problematic for some in the voluntary carbon market. There are also considerations in the design of the emissions trading scheme that really work for us in our domestic policy context, but don't fit the mold in terms of how project-based forest accounting works in overseas markets. For example, the 50-year threshold that's used for defining forestry, and so which, our concept of permanence, how we assess additionality using a 1990 base year, those types of considerations also come into play. So it's a bit of a problem of mixing apples and oranges across the voluntary and compliance carbon markets. This was less of a problem in the past where we had a different Kyoto units accounting system that made it possible to carve out some of the forestry units, and that just doesn't operate anymore. So it's a very complicated and evolving picture, and we'll need to continue to see how it changes over time. Providing policy clarity on the future of the voluntary carbon market is one of the highlights in our previous policy advice on emissions reduction plans. There is this enormous potential to try to mobilize people who want to do more stuff on climate change, and right now we don't have clear policy settings for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. And while you have the microphone and have been talking about the design of the ETS, another question through from Dan Brunskill. Why do you recommend the auction volumes get reduced so much more than the industrial free allocations? Shouldn't they both be reduced more equally?
The issue of industrial free allocation is framed in legislation, and it is given out on the basis of allocative baselines and activity data for the recipients. So the Commission does not advise at the moment on industrial allocation settings, as those are prescribed in legislation. Last year, the government passed some amendments that would adjust future industrial allocation, and that involves revising the allocative baselines and the electricity allocation factor. So over time, and as I said, we haven't been able to take those types of changes into account at this stage in our advice because the new settings just haven't come through in terms of the calculations, but we would expect that to impact on future advice, and we might see the volume of industrial free allocation reduce after that. There is a prescribed phase-out rate for industrial allocation in the Act, and we have taken that into account in our advice. There is the potential for the Commission to advise on either speeding up or slowing down that rate of phase-out, but we have to be invited by the government to provide that advice, and that invitation has not yet come through. It is certainly very striking when you look at the graph we put up during the presentation on our advice to see that the volume of free allocation, we're now entering a period where the volume of free allocation is greater than the auction volume, at least before we start to adjust the free allocation for the new allocative baselines and electricity factor, which will be coming through. So we have raised in our previous advice that maintaining the current phase out of industrial allocation is not necessarily going to remain consistent with our 2050 target over time. And that's a policy issue that needs to be addressed by the government.
Yeah, thank you. Joe, a question for you. What could be done to minimise market uncertainty, particularly with forestry, while the government reviews the incentives and disincentives for emitters and forestry?
Yeah, well, so It's really important, first of all, to acknowledge that we need both, and in fact, it's an and. We need forestry as part of our transition. We need to reduce emissions at source in the first place, and we also need offshore mitigation. So we all need all three of those. The key thing that we have been recommending to reduce that uncertainty is for the government to communicate what the desirable levels of reductions should be in all three of those areas. So that will give a longer term, what are we aiming for signal, which then helps people who are making investment decisions factor that into their, what they decide. So that's a key part of producing that, providing that greater predictability. Catherine, do you want to add to that?
Sure, thanks. To me, one of the huge values of introducing the framework that's in the Climate Change Response Act is about providing a longer term pathway in the form of emissions budgets toward the 2050 target, and then emissions reduction plans that lay out expectations for what's going to be needed to meet those targets. I really support, everything that Joe just said. Forests have a really important role to play. I think when the ETS review was held last year, one of the major sources of uncertainty was about the forest producers that were already in the ETS and whether there were going to be retrospective changes to their opportunities. So I think that future work is absolutely going to be needed in this area, but it could be done in a way that maintains market confidence, because we are going to need effective forestry and gross emissions reductions in the longer term.
Thank you. Catherine, whilst you have the microphone again, a very specific question here that references page 26 of the Commission's report. And in the page 26, it says, our approach takes into account the nature of emissions budgets, the NDC, and the 2050 target as ceilings on emissions rather than as bullseye targets. What does this mean?
Okay. I'll start with the NDC. So our 2030 NDC is defined as both a point year target in 2030 and a period-wide budget for cumulative emissions over 2021 to 2030. And so we're keeping an eye on both a single year estimate and on performance over an entire period. Emissions budgets are measured over period lengths, 2022 to 25 for the first one and 2026 to 2030 for the second one. So those are cumulative budget amounts that we're keeping an eye on. And this is, managing emissions reductions at this scale is like trying to steer a massive ship. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a 2-year time lag in the data before we know the impacts of policies and consumer behavior. And so given the uncertainties in the projections and the types of changes we're talking about across the economy, it's not something that you can necessarily deliver with bullseye accuracy. But both for adherence to the requirements in the legislation and under the Paris Agreement, and what's better for the climate is, if we're going to err because there's such uncertainty, we'd rather be under than over.
Excellent. Thank you. We're getting a lot of really technical ETS questions coming through here, which is fantastic, but it means that we're asking you to do quite a share of the talking, Catherine. Another question that's just popped through here from Mark Yates of Ecotricity. Mark's asking, can you give us an idea of how your work is referencing overseas ETS equivalent systems, please? The reason Mark asks is that many of Ecotricity's customers in NZ are internationals and take account the credibility of the NZ ETS mechanism versus their own.
Thank you for the question. So under the legislation, we are required to keep an eye on international emissions prices and policy developments in other countries as we develop all of our advice, and the ETS advice in particular. I think, it helps us to learn from what other systems are doing and to provide points of comparison. However, I think it's really important to remember that we always have sovereignty over our own price path. There is no convergence toward a single efficient global emissions price right now, and each jurisdiction is coming up with a mixture of pricing and policies that meets its own needs. So the relative nominal price in different emissions trading scheme or carbon pricing mechanisms, carbon taxes and so on, that may not actually reflect the level of mitigation effort that the country is making in order to meet its targets. So what we try to do is to make judgment by keeping an eye on what's happening in other systems and then asking ourselves, how does our ambition compare? What can we learn about the progress that they're making? But more importantly, what are our national circumstances and what is the emissions price that works for us to achieve the targets that we've set both domestically and internationally?
Thank you. And just to take a slight break from the technical questions, Joe, looking at impacts from ETS and settings, Joanna Santa Barbara asks, do you have any thoughts on what tools could be used for targeted support of families in light of increasing prices? And she mentions fuel prices here as an example.
Yeah. Thanks, Simon. So we've talked about this a bit in our advice over the last couple of years, and that is the importance of making use of the tools that already exist to manage impacts. So we need to make sure that we have the right incentives within the ETS for people who have struggled to make the change for various different reasons. There are the wider tools available to support change. Now, we give advice at a very high level on this, and that strategic level. It's really over to the government of the day to do the detailed work, to work out exactly how to target those policies. But the key thing is there are plenty of levers that can be used and a system to do so. Longer term, though, we also have pointed to the need to develop the equitable transitions approach more broadly, and that's to help support everyone to make that transition over the longer term, whether they are in a position where change is difficult, take into account what different regions might need in terms of both managing those risks and impacts, but also taking advantage of economic opportunities in terms of transition.
Thank you, Joe. And Catherine, back to the technical, back to a technical ETS question. A question here from Steve. How is it there remain so many? Sorry, that's the wrong question. I asked that one just before. Can you explain why our NDC requires lower emission levels than what the tailwind scenario identified as the potential reductions achievable within the country?
Great, thanks very much for the question. The NDC under the Paris Agreement and our emissions budgets were set under distinct processes with different sets of considerations. At the international level, the government was looking at what an equitable contribution would be to the international efforts under the Paris Agreement, taking a whole range of factors into account. And then emissions budgets were set as the domestic contribution toward meeting the NDC. And at the time the government made the decision on setting the revised NDC in 2021, it determined that in order to make an equitable global contribution, recognizing our opportunities as a relatively advanced developed country, that it would be appropriate for us to make a bigger contribution globally than what would be feasible at home. At the time that decision was made, we provided advice to the government on what different scenarios might be for how much harder we could push things domestically. And in our monitoring report that will be coming out this year, we'll be getting more information presented around how we're tracking against our targets and where the opportunities might be to go beyond the current emissions budgets. But some of the key analysis that's been done both by the Commission and by the government suggests that even going to a tailwind scenario, there would still leave a significant gap to meet the 2030 NDC, which would constitute an equitable contribution toward global progress. So it is definitely desirable to do as much as we can domestically, but we don't want to have a level of cost and disruption that's not consistent with the well-being of the economy as is required under the Act. So this is where the balance comes between domestic and overseas effort.
Thank you. Joe, we've had a question here, again, an ag-related question. Has the Commission considered the impact of New Zealand being the only country in the world wanting to price agricultural emissions, biogenic methane? Considering New Zealand farmers are one of the world's most efficient farming countries, wouldn't this send market share overseas to less efficient countries and actually increase global emissions while hurting the New Zealand economy?
So they're all really important points to think through in terms of helping transition our agricultural sector to that low emissions future. The Commission has previously been asked to give specific advice on some of the details to do with emissions pricing for agriculture. But of course, that sits outside of this ETS work. I think there is the key thing here is that the world is moving. And that we need to, and there's an opportunity for us as a country to take advantage of the potential for us to become that really low emissions producer in the future. We're in a good position now, but everyone else is also moving and developing their approaches to how they will reduce agricultural emissions. And the investment in options for reducing our agricultural emissions at home can also put us in a good position to help other pasture-based producers internationally. So we can potentially develop solutions that work for other systems that are similar to New Zealand. So really important to be thinking about our agricultural emissions reduction in that global context. We've got to remember that the rest of the world is not standing still on this, and by looking for those opportunities, we can actually end up in a better position in the longer term. Catherine, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, thanks. I really appreciate what you shared. Every country that signed up to the Paris Agreement is trying to support the goal of the Paris Agreement, and that involves significant reductions to agricultural methane and agricultural nitrous oxide emissions. Now, every country can decide the policy mix that it uses to achieve the reductions, in line with the global temperature goal. New Zealand has worked toward pricing for a long period of time, but other countries are using policies and other approaches. So I think the important point here is that because New Zealand has such a high renewable energy profile already, the agricultural emissions are particularly prominent for us at the moment. But as other countries decarbonize their energy sectors, they're going to be facing the same types of problems. And in terms of how they mitigate, and some of their systems may actually be more amenable to the types of mitigation opportunities that are coming through for agriculture than our system is. So I think this is we're at a really important point in time where we can prepare our sector to be supremely successful in a low emissions economy, by thinking ahead to what it's going to look like in the longer term and what measures need to be taken. Now, how we design an emissions pricing system that can help us to get there is, still work in progress, as Joe has mentioned, and it's an area of really important policy development. But our major customers and trading markets are going to be expecting to see responsible management of our agricultural emissions along with reductions in every other sector of the economy, and we need to figure out the best way to do that.
Thank you very much. Look, we have around 5 or 6 minutes worth of questions left, so I will try and get through as many of them with our speakers as we can. Catherine, a question here. Can you please walk us through why removals from forestry under the most recent MERP would not count for the current budget?
Great. There's an issue here both for the budget and for the NDC. So delivering on emissions budgets and on NDCs depends on the emissions that get reported in the inventory over the specified period. So our first emissions budget covers 2022 to 2025, and therefore removals that show up in our inventory of pre-2022 are not going to show up for compliance with the emissions budget. We don't have carryover between the pre-2022 period and the first emissions budget. And similarly in the NDC, when we've got surplus forestry removals from earlier years that are still sitting in the emissions trading scheme, those don't count toward helping to meet the NDC. So it's this, we've got a timing misalignment issue between the removals that count toward budgets in the NDC and the removals that show up in the ETS that are covered under banking. I think this is an issue for any jurisdiction that has an ETS under the framework of the Paris Agreement, and it's a real challenge for policy.
Thank you. Another question that's come through here, someone say, I'm interested in the discussion around the treatment of non-ETS policies that could help reduce the need for offshore mitigation for the NDC. The New Zealand steel deal is mentioned in the report. Just wondering what other measures could be considered and how the emissions reductions could be quantified.
I'll take a first stab at that one. Complementary measures in an ETS can be used for many different reasons. They can be used to help address non-price barriers, to help get things going. They can help on the innovation frontier to help with coordination and mobilizing investment for innovation. And it's this area of allowing additional emissions reductions within the ETS that opens up some really interesting opportunities. So the government's GIDI fund under the previous administration was providing public funding to help support emissions reduction activities in key industrial emitters. So New Zealand Steel was one, Fonterra was another, but there were a number of other recipients as well. And so it creates this possibility that if the government is helping to make it easier for some of the ETS participants to reduce their emissions, then we've got two choices. We can leave the cap as it stands and use that extra investment to redistribute who has to reduce emissions and who pays for the emissions within the cap, or we could ratchet the cap down to reflect the magnitude of emissions that's enabled by these complementary policies, and then use that to help improve our position under the Paris Agreement. Now, both of those are completely legitimate policy options, redistributing costs within the cap or ratcheting the cap down. And this is where we're asking for policy direction from the government about whether the ratchet kind of mechanism is the policy intention, and then that can help to guide us in future advice. In terms of quantifying the magnitude, some of them are going to be easier to quantify than others. The GIDI type investments are maybe more straightforward than others, but there are other policies that were introduced by previous governments that could also potentially count. So there's certainly boundary issues around the types of complementary measures that would count as well. Some of them will be easier to quantify than others. And we're also trying to do that quantification within the context of other changing real world conditions like oil prices and exchange rates and shipping costs and other things like that that can also influence emissions in the system. So that's why it opens up a really challenging area. But I think it is important to emphasize, some people say, oh, there's no point in doing complementary measures under an ETS because of this waterbed effect. But you can actually correct for the waterbed effect if you ratchet the cap down when you introduce these types of measures. So it's an important policy choice for the government, and we hope to see that clarification in the next emissions reduction plan.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to have one last question, and so we'll quickly answer. We'll quickly get some feedback on this, if possible. But is there a contradiction in the ETS where we want as much forestry as possible to help meet our targets, and the planting of more forests contributes to an oversupply?
So one of the challenges that we're facing in the system that we've been highlighting in our advice since 2021 is this issue of displacing one thing by another. So we need to see gross emissions reductions and forestry. And right now the ETS is set up so that one displaces the other. And it would be possible instead to design policy mechanisms that enable both to increase in ways that make it more strategic about how we meet our targets for the long term. So we do need mechanisms that incentivize forestry, and we need to think about what kind of forestry gets incentivized and where that forestry is. And, forestry has a really important role to play in the bioeconomy as well as a source of forestry removals, and it needs to be recognized and incentivized that way. So this is where we really need a comprehensive look at the role of forestry in helping to meet our targets and provide these clear investment signals so that people understand the role of the ETS in supporting forestry and then what else is going to work in the long term. But one of the key messages in our 2023 advice report and this one is that in the long term, we need durable incentives for forestry, and they are not going to come from the ETS. So in its current form, the ETS actually doesn't work for gross emissions reductions in the near term or for forestry in the long term. And so we really need a solution that's going to serve both.
Thank you. And that is a great challenge for us to wrap up on today. Look, Catherine and Joe, I'd like to thank you both very much